12,000 years ago, a population of grizzlies. No wolves, no competing predators, no reason to share resources or retreat from anything. For 12,000 years, the island did one thing to those bears. It made them perfect. The Kodiak bear is not a grizzly bear that got bigger, and there are roughly 3,500 of them living on an island the size of Connecticut. Let's talk about what that actually means. Dog, maybe something that comes up to your chest. A mature male Kodiak bear stands between 9 and 10 feet tall when upright. That is not an exaggeration. That is taller than most ceilings in your home. On all fours, a large male still reaches the shoulder height of a draft horse. They weigh between 1,000 and 1,500 pounds. The largest confirmed Kodiak on record weighed over 1,600 pounds. To put that in terms you can feel, an average NFL offensive lineman weighs around 320 pounds and can bench press over 400 pounds. A Kodiak bear can generate more force with a single swipe of its paw than that lineman can produce with his entire body. The paw itself is roughly the size of a dinner plate, tipped with claws that can reach 4 inches in length. One strike from that paw produces force consistent with what it would take to crush the skull of an adult moose. What most people don't consider is what that body is built to do beyond raw power. A Kodiak bear can sprint at speeds exceeding 35 miles per hour, roughly the speed of a racehorse at full gallop, and sustain that speed across terrain that would slow a human to a walk. Rocky slopes, dense brush, shallow river crossings. The anatomy that makes them massive also makes them extraordinarily capable in the environment they were built for. Their sense of smell is estimated to be 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's. They can detect a food source from over 20 miles away. Their hearing picks up frequencies outside the human range, and their eyesight, despite the common assumption, is roughly equivalent to a human's at distance, with significantly better low-light performance. In practical terms, this means a Kodiak bear on Kodiak Island almost certainly knows you are there before you know it is. But size alone doesn't explain why Kodiak bears are different from grizzlies on the mainland. What makes them different is what 12,000 years of isolation actually did to their biology. On the mainland, grizzly bears compete. They compete with wolves for salmon runs. They compete with each other for territory. They compete with mountain lions, black bears, and other predators for the same food sources. That competition shapes behavior. It creates bears that are aggressive, but also bears that have learned, over thousands of years, to be cautious, to weigh risk, to sometimes retreat. On Kodiak Island, that pressure never existed. There are no wolves on Kodiak Island. There are no competing apex predators. For 12,000 years, the only thing that determined which bears passed on their genes was size, strength, and dominance. The result is an animal that has been selectively shaped by isolation into something that does not carry the same risk calculations that mainland grizzlies do. Kodiak bears are not more aggressive because they are meaner. They are more direct because they have never needed to be anything else. Biologists who study them describe a behavioral profile that is distinct from mainland grizzlies in one specific way. Kodiak bears, when they decide to approach something, rarely stop. That distinction matters more than the size. The salmon runs on Kodiak Island are extraordinary. The island sits at the convergence of several river systems that produce some of the densest salmon populations in North America. During peak season, a single mature male Kodiak bear can consume 20,000 calories per day. That's the equivalent of roughly 57 Big Macs, daily. They need that intake because they are preparing for a hibernation that will last up to 6 months, during which they will lose between 30 and 40% of their body weight without eating, drinking, or waking. What happens physiologically during that hibernation is, in its own way, remarkable. A Kodiak bear's heart rate drops from a normal 40 beats per minute to as low as 8. Its body temperature falls by only a few degrees, unlike true hibernators, which means it can wake and respond to a threat within seconds. It is not unconscious. It is simply waiting. When it emerges in spring, after 6 months without food, a mature male Kodiak bear is still over 800 pounds, still faster than a racehorse, still capable of exerting hundreds of pounds of force with a single limb. What most people don't know is what their metabolism does between those seasons. In the weeks leading up to hyperphagia, the feeding frenzy before hibernation, Kodiak bears enter a state of metabolic aggression that biologists still don't fully understand. Their cortisol levels spike, their tolerance for disruption drops, their willingness to defend food sources from any perceived threat increases dramatically. This is the state most hikers and campers encounter without knowing it, because the peak salmon season on Kodiak Island runs directly through July and August, the most popular months for human visitors. On the morning of September 2nd, 2005, a bear researcher and field biologist was conducting behavioral observations near a salmon stream in the interior of Kodiak Island. He had worked on the island for years. He knew the protocols. He was experienced, cautious, and familiar with the terrain. He was observing a group of bears at a distance when one subadult male, approximately 5 years old and already weighing over 600 pounds, broke from the group and charged without warning. The attack lasted less than 30 seconds. When the bear disengaged and left, the researcher had sustained deep lacerations across his face, a fractured orbital bone, significant damage to his left arm, and wounds to his upper back, consistent with bite marks from a bear attempting to establish grip. He survived. He was airlifted to a hospital in Kodiak City and underwent multiple surgeries. What makes this case significant to researchers is not the severity of the attack. It is the profile of the bear that committed it. It was not an adult male defending a kill. It was not a female protecting cubs. It was a subadult, a young bear that had not yet reached full size, that made a decision to attack an experienced researcher in an open area with no apparent provocation beyond proximity. That behavior is unusual in mainland grizzlies. It is less unusual in Kodiaks. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game maintains detailed records of bear-human incidents on Kodiak Island going back to the 1960s. The pattern in those records is consistent. Kodiak bear encounters that escalate to contact do so faster, with less warning behavior and with more physical force than comparable grizzly encounters on the mainland. Rangers and guides who work the island regularly describe a specific experience that people who have only encountered mainland bears often don't expect. The Bluff charge, the fake charge that most grizzlies use to test an intruder before deciding whether to commit, is shorter on Kodiak Island. Sometimes it doesn't happen at all. One guide with over 2 decades of experience on the island described it this way: with a mainland grizzly, you usually get a conversation. With a Kodiak, sometimes the conversation is already over by the time you realize it started. In 2019, a group of sport fishermen encountered a large male near a river system in the northern part of the island. The bear had been feeding and was not surprised by their approach. They had made noise, followed protocols, and given the animal what they believed was sufficient space. The bear charged at approximately 40 yards. One member of the group deployed bear spray at roughly 25 feet. The bear stopped, shook its head, and moved off. The incident report filed with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game notes that the bear's initial charge covered 40 yards in under 4 seconds. For reference, Usain Bolt's world record 100-meter sprint averages out to roughly 10 meters per second at peak speed. This bear, at an estimated weight of 1,100 pounds, covered that distance at approximately 9 meters per second. The fishermen were not doing anything wrong. They followed every recommended protocol. The bear charged anyway. What researchers have spent decades trying to understand is what specifically makes Kodiak bears different in their threat assessment. Not just physically larger, but behaviorally distinct in ways that don't map cleanly onto what we know about grizzlies. Part of the answer may lie in something called resource density conditioning. On Kodiak Island, the food supply is so concentrated, the salmon runs so dense, the vegetation so rich, that bears on the island have developed a stronger territorial response to proximity than mainland bears that range over much larger areas. In simple terms, Kodiak bears have more to protect in a smaller space, and their behavior reflects that. But there is another element that researchers find harder to explain. Studies comparing the stress hormone profiles of Kodiak bears and mainland grizzlies have found that Kodiaks show lower baseline cortisol levels during non-hyperphagia seasons. Lower stress hormones typically mean calmer animals. They are not chronically aggressive in the way that food-stressed mainland. An aggressive animal gives you signals, raised hackles, vocalizations, bluff charges. It is communicating. It is uncertain, without the pause that threat assessment normally creates. 12,000 years of being the largest, strongest, most dominant animal on an island, with no natural threats, produces a specific kind of behavioral profile. It produces an animal that doesn't bluff because it has never needed to. It produces an animal that is not driven by fear, not shaped by the memory of losing, and not carrying any evolutionary instruction that says, "There are things on this island that can hurt you." There aren't. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game recommends that anyone visiting Kodiak Island treat every bear encounter as potentially a first contact, not governed by the same rules that apply anywhere else. You are on an island where something has been at the top of the food chain for 12,000 years, and it doesn't know that you weren't always there.